Hannibal Barca. Part 1: Hannibal's World and Early Life. Hannibal Barca was born in 247 BCE into a world dominated by the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. At the time of his birth, Carthage was still reeling from its defeat in the First Punic War, 264–241 BCE. Once the dominant Mediterranean power, Carthage had lost control of Sicily, suffered economic devastation, and was now facing rising Roman aggression. The Carthaginian government was an oligarchic republic controlled by a mercantile aristocracy. Unlike Rome, which relied on citizen armies, Carthage hired mercenaries for its wars, a fact that would prove both a strength and a weakness. Its navy was formidable, but Rome had adapted by copying and improving Carthaginian ship designs. Hannibal's family, the Barcids, belonged to the military aristocracy and held a deep hatred for Rome. His father, Hannibal Barca, was one of the greatest Carthaginian generals and the architect of a bold plan to restore Carthaginian power by expanding into Iberia, modern Spain. According to Roman sources, when Hannibal was about 9 years old, his father took him to a sacred altar in Carthage and made him swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. Whether or not this is true, it is undeniable that Hannibal was raised in a fiercely anti-Roman household. Hamilcar took his son to Iberia in 237 BCE, determined to rebuild Carthaginian strength by conquering the rich lands of Spain. Hannibal was educated in warfare, diplomacy, and the harsh realities of leadership from a young age. For the next 16 years, Hamilcar and his successors, Hasdrubal the Fair, his son-in-law, and later Hannibal himself, transformed Iberia into a Carthaginian power base. They established the city of New Carthage, modern Cartagena, built a formidable army, and secured access to silver mines that would fund future wars. When Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BCE, Hasdrubal took over and pursued a more diplomatic strategy, signing a treaty with Rome that set the Ebro River as the boundary between Roman and Carthaginian interests. However, Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, and at the age of 26, Hannibal was chosen by the army to take command. Hannibal's early years shaped him into one of history's most formidable military leaders. He inherited his father's strategic vision, mastered guerrilla warfare from the Iberian campaigns, and learned the art of diplomacy and deception. However, he also inherited Carthage's political weaknesses, its reliance on mercenaries, its fragile relationship with the ruling elite, and the deep divisions within its government. With Iberia under his control and an army of battle-hardened veterans at his command, Hannibal was ready to challenge Rome directly. His first target, the city of Saguntum, Rome's ally in Iberia. Part 2: The outbreak of the Second Punic War and the march to Italy. In 219 BCE, Hannibal began his campaign by besieging Saguntum, a city that had allied with Rome but was located south of the Ebro River, thus violating the terms of the Roman-Carthaginian treaty. Rome had no direct interest in the city but saw its alliance as important for maintaining influence in Iberia. Hannibal's attack on Saguntum was a direct challenge to Roman power, and while he initially faced setbacks, the siege eventually succeeded. The siege was long and brutal, lasting several months, but Hannibal's forces, composed of Iberian, African, and mercenary soldiers, managed to breach the walls and capture the city. This act was seen as an act of war by Rome, who demanded Hannibal's surrender. Hannibal, however, showed no sign of retreat. Instead, he doubled down on his strategy, preparing for a direct confrontation with Rome. The Roman Senate was furious at Hannibal's audacity. Despite Rome's desire to avoid another costly war, the capture of Saguntum left them with little choice but to act. Rome declared war on Carthage in 218 BCE, marking the start of the Second Punic War. The Roman response was swift. They sent consuls to Spain to confront Hannibal's forces, while also preparing to defend Italy from a potential Carthaginian invasion. What made Hannibal truly legendary was his daring decision to march directly into Italy, something that had never been done by a Carthaginian general before. Instead of fighting Rome on familiar ground in Iberia, Hannibal sought to strike at the heart of the Roman Empire, hoping to shock the Romans into a panicked response that would weaken their control over their allies. The route he chose was treacherous through the Alps, a mountain range that had thwarted armies for centuries. Before embarking on this perilous journey, Hannibal meticulously gathered intelligence on the region, securing food supplies and ensuring that his troops were properly equipped for the harsh winter conditions. The army was diverse, with soldiers from different parts of the Carthaginian Empire: Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Africans. The discipline of these soldiers, under Hannibal's strict command, was crucial to their survival in the Alps. The journey was grueling, lasting almost 2 months. Hannibal's forces battled freezing temperatures, treacherous mountain passes, and fierce local tribes. Many soldiers died, and some historians suggest that up to half of his army was lost. Yet despite these losses, Hannibal emerged on the other side of the Alps in northern Italy with around 20,000 soldiers, including a small number of war elephants, symbols of his audacity and determination. The crossing of the Alps is often regarded as one of Hannibal's most brilliant and audacious military feats. The element of surprise was critical. By invading Italy directly, Hannibal forced Rome to fight a war on its own soil, away from the familiar defensive lines of Italy's southern border. In doing so, he threatened Rome's heartland, forcing them to stretch their resources thin and contend with the morale-shattering reality of an invading force. Furthermore, Hannibal demonstrated his profound understanding of logistics. He adapted his strategy based on terrain and weather, proving that his ability to improvise and innovate in the face of adversity set him apart from many of his contemporaries. However, this march also had long-term consequences. The loss of so many soldiers and the difficulty of supplying such a large army would come to haunt him in the following years. After descending into northern Italy, Hannibal's army quickly faced Roman forces led by Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the future Roman general Scipio Africanus. The first battle, the Battle of the Ticinus River in 218 BCE, was a relatively minor engagement, but it had significant consequences. Hannibal's forces decisively defeated the Romans, forcing Scipio to retreat. More importantly, the victory demonstrated that Hannibal was no longer just a threat in Iberia. He was a direct and immediate danger to Roman control over Italy. The news of Hannibal's victory at the Ticinus River spread quickly through Rome, and panic set in. The Senate appointed Gaius Flaminius and Lucius Fabius Maximus as consuls for the following year, each tasked with confronting the Carthaginian general. While Flaminius was aggressive and eager to meet Hannibal in open battle, Fabius was more cautious and advocated for a strategy of attrition, using guerrilla tactics to avoid direct confrontation and weaken Hannibal's forces over time. The Fabian strategy would become crucial in the months that followed. The Roman response to Hannibal's invasion highlights the divide within Roman military and political circles. On one hand, you had aggressive generals like Flaminius, who believed that Hannibal could be beaten quickly with a direct confrontation. On the other, you had more cautious figures like Fabius, who understood that Hannibal's army was not only superior in numbers but also highly mobile and experienced. The failure to unite behind a single strategy proved costly for Rome in the early years of the war. Part 3: The Battles of Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Hannibal's Triumphs. After his victory at the Ticinus River, Hannibal pressed deeper into Italy, forcing the Romans to react. The first major engagement came at the Battle of Trebia, fought near the Trebia River in northern Italy. This battle is an excellent example of Hannibal's mastery of tactics and his understanding of battlefield psychology. Hannibal positioned his army in a way that maximized his strengths. The Romans, led by Sempronius Longus, were eager to engage, despite having suffered earlier losses. Hannibal had carefully studied the Roman position and anticipated their movements. He placed his troops across the river using the cold conditions of late December to his advantage. As the Romans crossed the river, his forces were ready. In a masterful use of deception, Hannibal arranged his troops in a seemingly vulnerable position, luring the Romans into attacking. His Numidian cavalry, hiding on the flanks, ambushed the Roman forces at the perfect moment, while the Carthaginian infantry closed in on the enemy's vulnerable sides. The Romans were caught in a double envelopment, a tactic that would become a hallmark of Hannibal's campaigns. The result was a decisive Carthaginian victory. The Romans lost around 26,000 soldiers, including many high-ranking officers. This was a significant blow to Roman morale, particularly given that Hannibal had once again outsmarted them by exploiting their overconfidence and strategic miscalculations. The Battle of Trebia is often cited as one of Hannibal's greatest successes. His ability to outmaneuver a numerically superior enemy was a testament to his deep understanding of battlefield tactics. The use of deception, the clever placement of his troops, and his ability to take advantage of Roman overconfidence were all key elements of his success. What makes this battle stand out is Hannibal's ability to manipulate terrain, weather, and timing to create an overwhelming tactical advantage. He didn't just rely on brute force. He used intelligence, planning, and psychological warfare to break the Roman will to fight. Less than 6 months after his victory at Trebia, Hannibal faced the Romans again, this time at Lake Trasimene in central Italy. The Battle of Lake Trasimene is considered one of the most stunning ambushes in military history. Hannibal's brilliance in setting traps and ambushing the Romans reached its peak in this battle. The Roman consuls for the year, Gaius Flaminius and Minucius Rufus, were determined to confront Hannibal. Flaminius, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics, was once again eager to take the fight directly to the Carthaginian general. Hannibal, however, was prepared to use his enemy's recklessness against them. He positioned his army in a narrow pass between the hills surrounding Lake Trasimene, using the terrain to mask his forces from view. As the Romans marched into the trap, they were ambushed from 3 sides by Carthaginian forces. The Romans were encircled with nowhere to retreat. The battle was swift and brutal, with the Romans suffering an estimated 15,000-20,000 casualties. Most notably, Flaminius himself was killed in the battle, and the rest of his army was decimated. The Battle of Lake Trasimene stands as a prime example of Hannibal's ability to think several moves ahead of his opponents. He used the natural landscape to conceal his forces, relying on timing and terrain to create a devastating ambush. Flaminius's decision to pursue Hannibal recklessly, without considering the possibility of a trap, played right into the Carthaginian general's hands. Hannibal's success at Lake Trasimene showed that he wasn't merely a battlefield commander, he was a master of psychological warfare. The ambush had a profound impact on Roman morale, shaking the belief that they were invincible. It also further demonstrated that Hannibal was a highly adaptable strategist, able to exploit Roman weaknesses with precision and finesse. After suffering heavy losses at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, the Romans began to realize that they needed to rethink their strategy. The Senate, deeply concerned by the losses, appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator in 217 BCE. His approach was one of cautious attrition, avoiding direct confrontations with Hannibal, and instead focusing on cutting off his supplies, harassing his forces, and waiting for the Carthaginian general to make a mistake. This new strategy, which came to be known as the Fabian strategy, was essential for preserving Rome's strength while denying Hannibal the decisive battle he craved. However, the strategy was not universally popular. Many Roman citizens and soldiers wanted to take the fight directly to Hannibal and were frustrated by the cautious approach. The Fabian strategy is often viewed as one of Rome's most important military adaptations during the war. Fabius Maximus understood that Hannibal's army was a formidable force, but it could not be sustained indefinitely. By avoiding battle and harassing Carthaginian supply lines, Rome bought time to rebuild its forces. However, the strategy was not without its own challenges. The Roman Senate faced internal pressure from more aggressive factions, and public opinion was divided. Fabius's approach was seen as weak by many, leading to political friction in Rome. Yet it was ultimately successful in staving off Hannibal's advances and buying crucial time for Rome to regroup and prepare for future battles. Despite the Roman setbacks, Hannibal's position was far from secure. His army, while powerful, was stretched thin, and the logistical challenges of maintaining a foreign campaign in hostile territory began to take a toll. Hannibal needed more than victories. He needed reinforcements, resources, and the support of Rome's allies to sustain his campaign. Without these, the prospect of a prolonged war against the vast Roman Republic seemed increasingly uncertain. Part 4: The Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's greatest victory. By 216 BCE, the Second Punic War had reached a critical juncture. Hannibal's victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene had shaken Rome to its core, but the Roman Senate was determined to continue the fight. Despite the success of the Fabian strategy, many Romans, especially the general public and the military elite, demanded a more aggressive approach. The Senate, under immense pressure, appointed two new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Both were eager to confront Hannibal directly. Despite the fact that Hannibal had already demonstrated his ability to outmaneuver Roman armies, the consuls decided to gather an army of unprecedented size, approximately 80,000 men, and march to meet the Carthaginian general head-on in the Apulian plain in southern Italy. Hannibal, however, was not intimidated by the Roman numbers. His army, while smaller, around 50,000 men, was highly experienced, battle-hardened, and intimately familiar with his methods of warfare. He knew that in order to defeat Rome, he needed to deliver a crushing blow that would shatter the Roman army's morale and military cohesion. Cannae would be that moment. The Battle of Cannae, fought on August 2, 216 BCE, is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. Hannibal executed a daring strategy that capitalized on the strengths of his army while exploiting the weaknesses of the Roman formation. Hannibal arranged his forces in a double envelopment formation, a brilliant maneuver that would become his signature tactic. The center of his army consisted of Gauls and Celtiberians, troops who were less disciplined but used as a battering ram to hold the Roman forces in place. The Carthaginian cavalry, commanded by the Numidians and a smaller force of Spanish horsemen, was stationed on the wings, with the goal of enveloping the Roman flanks. Behind the center, Hannibal placed his most disciplined forces, African infantry, prepared to seal off any Roman retreat. The Roman army, under the dual consuls Varro and Paulus, advanced with their typical heavy infantry formation. The Roman soldiers were confident in their numerical superiority, as they vastly outnumbered Hannibal's forces. They assumed their superior numbers and discipline would crush the Carthaginian lines. However, Hannibal had anticipated this mindset. As the battle began, the Carthaginian center retreated, drawing the Romans in and creating a bulge in the Roman lines. This played perfectly into Hannibal's plan. The Romans, eager to press their advantage, followed the retreating center, further compacting their formation. As the Romans pushed deeper into the Carthaginian lines, Hannibal's cavalry on the wings executed a devastating maneuver. They broke through the Roman cavalry and attacked the Roman infantry's flanks. At this point, Hannibal's African infantry, positioned behind the center, moved forward to envelop the Roman legions completely. The Romans were now surrounded on all sides with no escape. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Roman soldiers, trapped in a narrowing circle, were slaughtered by the thousands. The Roman defeat at Cannae was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that around 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed or captured, including many high-ranking officers. The two Roman consuls were both killed in the battle, marking a significant loss of leadership for Rome. The Romans had never experienced such a crushing defeat. The psychological shock to the Roman Republic was immense, and for the first time in the war, it seemed that Hannibal might be able to achieve his goal of breaking the Roman will to fight. Despite his victory, Hannibal did not immediately capitalize on his triumph. He did not march on Rome itself. Instead, he chose to consolidate his position and gather supplies. This decision has been the subject of much debate among historians. Some argue that Hannibal's failure to march on Rome after Cannae was a missed opportunity, a decision that ultimately doomed his campaign. Others suggest that his army, though victorious, was weakened and lacked the resources to lay siege to Rome. Nevertheless, the defeat at Cannae shook Rome to its core. Rome's allies, once loyal, began to consider switching sides. Several Italian city-states, including Capua, defected to Hannibal's cause. It seemed as though Hannibal's grand strategy was finally beginning to bear fruit. The Battle of Cannae is a textbook example of encirclement warfare, a tactic that exploits an enemy's overextension and lack of mobility. Hannibal's brilliance lay in his ability to manipulate the battlefield and create an inevitable conclusion to the conflict. His careful planning, ability to control the flow of the battle, and the use of terrain and deception all came together in a perfect storm that left the Romans decimated. In many ways, Cannae was the culmination of Hannibal's strategic genius. He understood the psychology of warfare and how to manipulate his opponents. By giving the Romans a false sense of superiority, he lured them into a trap where their strength became their weakness. However, there were strategic limitations to Hannibal's victory. Despite the immense Roman loss, he did not have the resources or manpower to deliver the final blow to Rome. While his army was formidable, it was still composed largely of mercenaries and allied forces. Hannibal lacked the political support and reinforcements that would have allowed him to fully capitalize on his victory. The Roman Senate, though devastated by the loss at Cannae, did not surrender. Instead, it rallied its forces for a long, difficult recovery. The Romans implemented a new strategy, focusing on guerrilla tactics, cutting off Hannibal's supply lines and avoiding direct confrontation until they could rebuild their army. The Fabian strategy would continue to play a role, and the Romans began training new armies, emphasizing flexibility and mobility over the rigid formation that had failed them at Cannae. One of the most crucial elements of Rome's recovery was the leadership of Quintus Fabius Maximus, who remained in charge of the defensive efforts. He advocated for indirect engagements, denying Hannibal the decisive battle he craved. Fabius's leadership would prove critical in keeping Rome in the fight, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Despite the devastating loss at Cannae, Rome's resilience was on display as they regrouped and began to slowly turn the tide of the war. Part 5: The Long War, Hannibal's stalemate and Rome's counteroffensive. After his stunning victory at Cannae, Hannibal found himself in a position where his initial triumphs began to turn into a strategic dilemma. While the defeat of the Roman army had been decisive, Hannibal lacked the resources to press his advantage to a successful conclusion. Rome, despite its staggering losses, was not broken. Instead, the Romans dug in, relying on their resilience, deep reserves of manpower, and their ability to maintain a war effort even in the face of major setbacks. Hannibal's army, though still formidable, was a patchwork of diverse mercenaries and allied forces. This posed a significant challenge to Hannibal. His troops were largely drawn from different parts of the Mediterranean and had differing cultural backgrounds and loyalties. Additionally, his army was far from home, deep in hostile territory, with limited access to reinforcements or supplies. This made it increasingly difficult for Hannibal to maintain the momentum he had gained after Cannae. The Romans, devastated but far from defeated, reorganized and adapted. Rome's ability to replace its losses with fresh soldiers was critical to its recovery. Moreover, the Roman Senate appointed new commanders with a fresh approach to the war. Among these commanders, Publius Cornelius Scipio the Elder emerged as one of the most capable and forward-thinking. Scipio understood that the war needed to be fought both on land and at sea, and he advocated for a strategy that would undermine Hannibal's position through both direct and indirect means. The Romans also began to recognize that Hannibal's success was largely due to his ability to win battles, not to control territory. As a result, Rome shifted its focus to weakening Hannibal's supply lines and eroding his support base in southern Italy. This would require a combination of military and diplomatic strategies, and the Romans worked tirelessly to regain control of their former allies, many of whom had defected to Hannibal's side. One of the most pivotal moments in this phase of the war was the Roman reconquest of Capua, a wealthy city-state that had been one of Hannibal's most important allies. Capua's defection had been a major blow to Rome, but the Romans, under the leadership of Fabius Maximus, successfully besieged and retook it. This not only denied Hannibal a key strategic position, but also showcased the Romans' growing ability to recover from their losses and reassert control over their territories. Despite his successes on the battlefield, Hannibal's situation was becoming more precarious. He lacked the resources to expand his territorial holdings or to move against Rome itself. His forces were constrained by a lack of reinforcements, and the long war of attrition was beginning to wear down his army. Moreover, the cities and allies that had initially rallied to his side were slowly being reclaimed by Rome. Hannibal had no permanent base of operations in Italy and was unable to secure the logistics and resources he needed to sustain his army. This period of stagnation is often referred to as a stalemate. Hannibal continued to wage a war of maneuver, trying to harry Roman forces and disrupt their efforts, but he was unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Rome, meanwhile, was making slow but steady progress in regaining lost territory and rebuilding its military strength. After years of bloody conflict, the Second Punic War began to reach its climax with the rise of Scipio Africanus, the Roman general who had been quietly rebuilding Roman strength while also launching expeditions to Carthaginian-held territories in Spain. Scipio's campaign in Spain, which began in earnest in 211 BCE, had dealt Carthage a series of devastating blows, and by 206 BCE, he had forced the Carthaginians to evacuate the Iberian Peninsula. This campaign not only deprived Hannibal of crucial reinforcements, but also weakened Carthage's position across the Mediterranean. In 204 BCE, Scipio took the bold step of invading North Africa, directly threatening Carthage itself. This move forced the Carthaginian Senate to recall Hannibal from Italy, where he had been operating for over a decade. Hannibal's presence in Italy had been a major source of hope for Carthage, but the escalating situation in North Africa left the Carthaginian government with no choice but to bring him back to defend his homeland. In 202 BCE, the two great generals, Hannibal and Scipio, met at Zama near Carthage. The Battle of Zama would be the decisive confrontation of the Second Punic War. Hannibal's forces, although still strong, had been significantly weakened by years of conflict. His army was not the formidable fighting force it had been at Cannae, and his command was no longer able to rely on the element of surprise or overwhelming numbers. Scipio, on the other hand, had the advantage of reinforcements, having been reinforced by Roman forces from Spain, and was able to field a well-coordinated and disciplined army. The battle itself was a dramatic clash of two brilliant military minds. Hannibal deployed his forces in a similar formation to Cannae, relying on the strength of his infantry and cavalry. Scipio, however, had learned from Hannibal's previous victories and employed countermeasures to negate the Carthaginian tactics. Scipio used his cavalry effectively, deploying them to harass Hannibal's flanks and creating gaps in his lines. He also used a clever tactic to weaken Hannibal's cavalry by creating gaps in his formation, forcing Hannibal's forces to fight in disarray. After several hours of fierce fighting, Scipio's forces broke through Hannibal's center, and the Carthaginian forces began to collapse. Hannibal's famed cavalry was unable to turn the tide as it had in the past, and his infantry, exhausted and outmaneuvered, was eventually routed. The battle was a decisive Roman victory, and Hannibal's forces were effectively crushed. The Battle of Zama marked the end of the Second Punic War. Although Hannibal fought valiantly, his forces were no match for Scipio's disciplined Roman legions and cavalry. Hannibal's inability to secure reinforcements, his lack of sufficient resources, and the overwhelming strategic pressure of Scipio's moves in Spain and North Africa ultimately doomed him. Rome's victory at Zama ensured its dominance over the Western Mediterranean and secured the future of the Roman Republic. For Hannibal, the defeat at Zama was the end of his long and brilliant military career. He was forced to flee Carthage and would spend the rest of his life in exile. Part 6: The Aftermath, Hannibal's Legacy and the Fall of Carthage. After his defeat at Zama in 202 BCE, Hannibal's once glorious career as a military commander came to an end. Carthage, though still a powerful city-state, had been irrevocably altered by the war. The peace terms that followed the defeat at Zama were harsh, and Hannibal's position in Carthage became untenable. Carthage was forced to surrender most of its territories, including Spain, and was required to pay a crippling indemnity to Rome. Carthage's fleet was reduced to a fraction of its former size, and the city was effectively restricted from waging war without Roman consent. Although he had been a hero to many in Carthage for his earlier victories, Hannibal's defeat at Zama made it difficult for him to maintain political power. Fearing Roman reprisal and political infighting within Carthage, Hannibal fled into voluntary exile. He sought refuge in the courts of various Eastern Mediterranean monarchs, hoping to find a way to continue his struggle against Rome. Hannibal's later years were marked by his involvement in several diplomatic and military ventures, though none of them achieved the scale of his earlier campaigns. His most notable involvement was in the service of King Prusia's I of Bithynia, a kingdom on the coast of modern-day Turkey. During his time in Bithynia, Hannibal was said to have advised Prusias on military matters, although these engagements were less significant in terms of military victories. In 183 BCE, as the Roman Empire grew increasingly concerned about Hannibal's influence and potential for inciting rebellion against Rome, they pressured King Prusias to surrender him. Hannibal, determined not to fall into Roman hands, took his own life by poisoning himself. His death marked the end of an era for Carthage and for the Roman Republic's greatest adversary. Hannibal's legacy, however, lived on long after his death. His genius as a strategist and tactician was recognized and admired by future military leaders. His use of deception, surprise, and the exploitation of the enemy's weaknesses set the foundation for many military doctrines in the centuries that followed. His greatest victory at Cannae would be studied and revered for generations to come, and even the most successful military leaders would reference his strategies in their own campaigns. While Hannibal's life came to a tragic and somewhat inglorious end, the fate of Carthage itself would be even more devastating. The Treaty of Zama, 202 BCE, placed severe restrictions on Carthage, but the city-state continued to thrive economically for a time. Carthage, now a shadow of its former self, was forced to pay substantial tribute to Rome and was not allowed to rebuild its military to any meaningful extent. However, Carthage's merchant economy remained strong, and the city continued to engage in trade across the Mediterranean. As the decades passed, however, Carthage's relationship with Rome grew increasingly strained. The Roman Senate, ever wary of Carthaginian resurgence, began to view the city's continued prosperity with suspicion. Rome had not forgotten the destruction that Carthage had wrought during the Punic Wars, and there were many in Rome who believed that the city was still a threat. One of the most vocal proponents of the total destruction of Carthage was Cato the Elder, a Roman statesman and military leader who had been involved in the wars against Hannibal. Cato, a staunch conservative, famously ended every speech in the Roman Senate with the words, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. He viewed Carthage as an existential threat to Rome, and he believed that the only way to ensure Rome's continued supremacy in the Mediterranean was to eliminate its old rival. In 150 BCE, tensions between Rome and Carthage reached a boiling point. The Carthaginians, unable to defend themselves militarily due to the constraints imposed by Rome, found themselves caught between two conflicting pressures. On the one hand, they needed to protect their territory from the growing threat of Rome. On the other hand, they faced growing internal instability and the desire for independence from Roman dominance. In a final act of desperation, the Carthaginians waged a war against the neighboring Numidians who were backed by Rome. The Romans, seeing this as a violation of the peace treaty that had been imposed after the Punic Wars, declared war on Carthage once again. This time, there would be no mercy. The Third Punic War began in 149 BCE, and it was marked by a systematic Roman campaign to eliminate Carthage once and for all. The Romans, under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, laid siege to the city. Carthage, though still wealthy, was no match for Rome's overwhelming military power. The siege of Carthage lasted for 3 years. The Romans employed brutal tactics to starve the city and destroy its fortifications. Despite the city's desperate resistance, the Carthaginians were unable to break the Roman blockade or prevent the systematic destruction of their resources. The Carthaginian leadership, including the general Hasdrubal, fought bravely, but they were unable to hold off the Roman onslaught. In 146 BCE, the Romans breached the walls of Carthage. The city was sacked and its inhabitants were either killed or enslaved. The destruction was total. The city was razed to the ground and its surviving citizens were forced into exile or enslaved. To ensure that Carthage would never rise again, the Romans reportedly sowed salt into the earth to render the land infertile, symbolizing the complete annihilation of the Carthaginian state. Thus, the once great city of Carthage was destroyed, and the Punic Wars came to a definitive and tragic end. Rome, having eliminated its greatest rival, would go on to become the undisputed power in the Mediterranean. Although Carthage had been destroyed, Hannibal's legacy lived on in the Roman world. Roman generals, including Scipio Aemilianus and later commanders, would study his tactics for years to come. Hannibal's ability to strike quickly, decisively, and with overwhelming force continued to influence military thinking. He remained a symbol of the threat that Rome had overcome, but also a testament to the resilience of a general who had fought with unparalleled skill. While Rome ultimately triumphed, Hannibal's military brilliance had ensured that the memory of the Second Punic War would never be forgotten. He was remembered not only as Rome's greatest adversary, but as a military genius whose methods would echo through history. Conclusion: Hannibal's enduring legacy. The life of Hannibal Barca is one of the most captivating and tragic tales in the annals of military history. From his early vow of hatred toward Rome to his brilliant victories on the battlefield, Hannibal's career exemplifies the heights of military genius, the bitterness of conflict, and the complexities of warfare in the ancient world. Despite his tactical brilliance and early successes, his story also serves as a poignant reminder of the limitations faced by even the greatest commanders when confronted with overwhelming political and logistical challenges. At the core of Hannibal's legacy lies his revolutionary approach to warfare. His strategies at Cannae and other battles showcased his ability to outthink and outmaneuver larger and more powerful armies, setting a standard for military strategy that would resonate through the centuries. Hannibal's tactics, such as the double envelopment at Cannae, would become benchmarks of battlefield mastery, studied by military leaders throughout history, from Napoleon Bonaparte to modern commanders in the 20th and 21st centuries. Hannibal was not merely a general but a tactician of the highest order. He understood the psychological as well as the physical dimensions of warfare, using surprise, deception, and the manipulation of terrain to outwit his enemies. His ability to turn seemingly impossible situations into opportunities for victory demonstrated his deep understanding of the art of war. Even when faced with overwhelming odds, Hannibal was able to adapt, utilizing his troops' strengths and exploiting Roman weaknesses to devastating effect. Yet for all his brilliance, Hannibal's ultimate failure underscores the cruel realities of war and the limitations of even the greatest military leaders. His inability to decisively end the war after the victory at Cannae was a critical flaw that contributed to his eventual defeat. The Romans, though battered and bruised, proved resilient in their recovery, while Hannibal's forces dwindled, starved, and were gradually weakened by lack of support, reinforcements, and supplies. Despite his efforts to undermine Rome, he could not overcome the Roman capacity for renewal and adaptation. The death of Hannibal in 183 BCE, poisoned by his own hand to avoid Roman capture, was the tragic final chapter in the story of a man who had once seemed poised to bring down the Roman Republic. His exile, marked by a series of fruitless diplomatic and military endeavors in the courts of Eastern Mediterranean kings, was a far cry from the power he had wielded in his prime. In the end, his death was not in battle, but in despair, a reminder that even the greatest minds of history cannot escape the crushing forces of fate and time. Hannibal's life cannot be separated from the fate of Carthage, his homeland which he fought so fiercely to protect. The Carthaginian Empire, once a dominant force in the ancient Mediterranean, was ultimately destroyed by the relentless power of Rome. The city of Carthage was obliterated in 146 BCE, marking the end of the Punic Wars and the final extinguishing of a once great rival. The rise of Rome as the undisputed power in the Mediterranean was sealed, and Carthage's destruction symbolized the unyielding nature of Roman expansionism. Yet while the city was destroyed, the memory of Carthage and of Hannibal lived on. The destruction of Carthage was not merely a military victory, it was a cultural and psychological triumph for Rome. Carthage's fall marked the end of an era, but Hannibal's presence would continue to haunt the Romans for centuries. His tactics and his defiance of Roman power remained embedded in the collective consciousness of the Republic, and even as Rome rose to unprecedented heights, the shadow of Hannibal's genius would continue to inspire and intimidate. In the centuries following his death, Hannibal became a figure who transcended his own time. He was both reviled and revered, an embodiment of defiance against an empire that would ultimately dominate the known world. Hannibal's story is not just one of a failed war, but of an indomitable spirit and an unparalleled mind. A man who embodied the eternal struggle between a rising power and a proud adversary fighting to hold on to its place in history. His legacy, however, is not one of unmitigated triumph, but rather of a brilliant but flawed figure who reached for greatness and in doing so reshaped the history of the Mediterranean world. His story teaches us valuable lessons about leadership, the complexities of war, and the deep costs of ambition. While the Romans ultimately triumphed, they did so only after learning from the very methods of war that Hannibal had perfected, methods that would be passed down for generations. For the Romans, Hannibal was a living symbol of the enemy they had overcome, and his genius became a benchmark by which future military campaigns were measured. His battles were studied in the schools of Rome, and his name became synonymous with military brilliance. In the end, Hannibal's legacy is that of a man who fought not for personal glory but for the survival of his people. He was a leader, a tactician, and a symbol of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Though he could not bring down Rome, his struggle and his unwavering dedication to his cause earned him a place in the annals of history as one of the greatest military minds to ever live. The Roman historian Livy captured the essence of Hannibal's dual nature, both as the formidable enemy and as the tragic hero in his writings, stating that Hannibal had been the most feared and respected of all Rome's enemies. His story, filled with both victories and defeats, highlights the eternal tension between the invincibility of power and the enduring strength of individual will. Even as Carthage disappeared from the map, the spirit of Hannibal lived on, ensuring that his story would never be forgotten. Hannibal's life and legacy, defined by his incredible triumphs and tragic fall, serve as a testament to the complexities of warfare, leadership, and the human spirit. His influence echoes in military doctrine to this day, and his story continues to inspire those who study the art of war. Hannibal, the general who could have changed the course of history, ultimately proved that even the greatest warriors are subject to forces beyond their control, yet their brilliance never fades from memory. The enduring appeal of Hannibal lies not just in his victories or his defeats, but in his ability to challenge the very limits of what was thought possible. His legacy remains a powerful reminder of the fragility and resilience of empire, the costs of ambition, and the deep, indelible mark that a single individual can leave on the world.